On January 3, 1956, a car was found running on a frozen road near the Sun River in Great Falls, Montana. The headlights were still on. The engine was still running. The radio was still playing into the empty cold. Beside the driver's door, an 18-year-old airman lay face down in the snow, a single gunshot wound to the back of his head. His name was Lloyd Duane Bogle. The girl who had been with him the night before was gone. Her name was Patricia Kalitzke. She was 16 years old. It would take 65 years to find out what happened to her. The cold that rolls across the northern Montana plains in January does not warn you. It does not negotiate. It arrives without permission, pushing down from the Canadian border with a kind of weight that feels almost deliberate, pressing through walls, freezing rivers solid, turning open land into something vast and hostile and silent. There are places where winter is a season. In northern Montana, winter is a presence. And on the night of January 2, 1956, it owned everything: the roads, the fields, the gravel strip near the Sun River where young couples had been parking for years, trading whispers and warmth in the dark, convinced in the way only the very young can be convinced that the night would always end gently, and tomorrow would always be waiting. That night, Patty and Duane drove out to that road together. She was 16, with a laugh people never forgot. He was 18, far from home, and completely in love. They had music. They had heat. They had time. Or at least, they thought they did. They were wrong. What happened on that frozen road in the early hours of January 3 would become the oldest unsolved double homicide in the history of Montana. It would outlast suspects. It would outlast investigators. It would outlast the families who spent decades waiting for an answer. And when the truth finally came in 2021, it didn't come from a confession. Or a witness. Or a mistake. It came from something almost impossible to see. A single microscopic cell, sealed onto a glass slide in 1956, and forgotten. Waiting. If the weight of 65 years of silence settles on you the way it settled on every detective who ever opened this file, please take a moment right now to like this video, drop a comment below, and subscribe to Cold Case, Solved Files. Every single click tells the algorithm that stories like this one matter. That victims like Patty and Duane matter. That cold cases are not puzzles to be admired, they are people to be remembered. Now let us go back to Great Falls, Montana. Back to the night that started everything. Back to the beginning of a silence that would last longer than anyone could have imagined was possible. Patricia and Kalitzke moved through the corridors of Great Falls High School the way water moves through familiar channels, with ease, with direction, with the quiet and unforced confidence of someone who has never once had to question where she belonged or whether she was wanted. She was a junior, 16 years old, a daughter of the northern Montana plains, and she was anchored in the social current of 1955 with the particular kind of warmth that makes a person the center of every circle they enter without ever having to demand it. Not the loud center. Not the girl who needed the room to look at her. The kind of center that people orient themselves toward without fully understanding the pull, the way a compass needle finds north without being told which direction to move. Her laugh, by the account of everyone who carried her memory into the decades that followed, was the kind of laugh that pulled people in and made them want to stay wherever she was. She was the girl everybody knew. She was the girl everybody genuinely liked. And she was 16 years old, standing at the beginning of everything, with the Montana horizon spread out flat and luminous in front of her, full of the particular light that belongs only to a future not yet lived. Lloyd Duane Bogle had arrived at Malmstrom Air Force Base in Great Falls from Waco, Texas, carried north by the machinery of the United States Air Force and assigned to the 29th Fighter Interceptor Squadron. He was 18 years old. He was a long way from everything familiar, from the Texas heat, from the roads he knew, from the faces that had always known him back. He was navigating the particular and persistent loneliness of being young and stationed far from home in a city that did not yet have a place for him. By December of 1955, he had found Patty Kalitzke, and suddenly the loneliness had somewhere to go. The detective who would later spend 9 years of his professional life dedicated to solving their murders described Bogle as instantly and completely smitten, the kind of falling that happens all at once and without warning and leaves no part of a person unchanged. They shared a frequency, the two of them. Music and dancing and the uncomplicated pleasure of a jukebox in a drive-in diner on a cold Montana evening. The whole world narrowed down to two people who knew the same words to the same songs and couldn't think of anywhere else they wanted to be. Within weeks, the airman from Texas and the junior from Great Falls High were inseparable. He carried a good camera everywhere he went. The kind of camera that a person buys when they genuinely care about holding on to the moments they're living through, when they understand instinctively that time moves and they want proof that they were somewhere worth remembering. When investigators found his car parked at the edge of the gravel near the Sun River on the morning of January 3, 1956, that camera was still sitting on the seat. Untouched. Exactly where he had left it. The film inside it would never be developed. Those photographs, whatever he had captured, whatever faces and places and ordinary moments he had framed and pressed the shutter for, would remain sealed in darkness forever. The evening of January 2 began the way evenings like that always began in Great Falls in 1956. They went to Pete's Drive-In, where the windows were fogged and the music was good and the cold outside felt like it belonged to a different world entirely. Just after 9 o'clock in the evening, they pulled out of the parking lot and onto the road heading toward the Sun River, toward Wadsworth Park, toward the familiar gravel strip where courting couples had been pulling off for as long as anyone in Cascade County could remember. The families of both young people, waking the next morning to empty houses and unanswered questions, reached immediately and instinctively for the most hopeful explanation that the era and the circumstances could provide. They had eloped. It happened. Young people in love and in a hurry had been making that particular impulsive decision since before anyone then living could remember. That was the age. That was the era. There would be a courthouse somewhere, a justice of the peace, and two young people grinning at each other in the early morning light of January 3. That hope lasted until noon. And then it stopped being hope and became something else. Something that did not have a gentle name. 3 boys out hiking near the Sun River that morning were the ones who found the car. It sat at the edge of the gravel, at the place where the open prairie gave way to shadow and privacy, at the spot that everyone in Great Falls knew by reputation if not by name. The engine was still running. The headlights were still burning into the gray morning air. The radio was still on, humming static into the cold. The car was in gear, pointing toward the road, positioned as though it intended to move at any moment, and it was going nowhere. Lloyd Duane Bogle lay face down in the frozen earth beside the driver's side door. His arms had been pulled behind his back and bound there with his own belt. Someone had then placed a firearm against the back of his head and fired a single shot. His wallet was still in his pocket. The camera rested undisturbed on the seat where he had left it. Not a single thing of material value had been taken from either the car or the body. This was not a robbery that turned violent. There was no panic in the arrangement of what had been left behind. There was no disorder, no evidence of anything having gone wrong with a plan. This was deliberate from beginning to end. This was someone who had arrived knowing exactly what they intended to do, who had done it with the kind of terrible focus that leaves no room for accident or impulse, and who had taken only one thing from that scene, the girl. Patricia Kalitzke was not there. The search that followed consumed Cascade County for 2 full days. Deputies and volunteers spread across the frozen landscape in every direction, reading the earth for any sign, any disturbance, any trace of a 16-year-old girl who had been somewhere on that road the night before. On January 4, a county road worker noticed something at the bottom of a 20-foot embankment along Vineyard Road, 5 miles north of the place where Bogle had been found. He climbed down the embankment. Patricia Kalitzke lay at the bottom, near an area that the locals called Hill 57. She had been shot in the head. The autopsy that followed confirmed what the investigators standing on that frozen embankment already feared and could not yet bring themselves to say aloud. She had been sexually assaulted. The forensic picture that assembled itself from those findings was constructed from geography and biology and the cruelest possible kind of logic. The killer had shot Lloyd Duane Bogle first. He had eliminated the threat. He had eliminated the witness. He had eliminated the only human being standing between himself and the girl he had come for. What had happened to Patty in the time between the Sun River and that embankment on Vineyard Road, in the minutes or the hours that separated those two locations across 5 miles of frozen Montana dark, belonged entirely to him. No one else had been there to see it. No one else had been there to stop it. And for 65 years, no one would be able to prove who he was. Great Falls, Montana, in January of 1956 was a city encountering a category of evil it had no language for. When the newspaper ran the headline about the Lover's Lane slaying, the community did what small cities do when the unthinkable breaks through the surface of ordinary life: it grieved, it raged, and it demanded a name. Law enforcement responded with everything the era allowed. The net they cast was wide and it stayed wide. Over the months and years and decades that followed, the investigative file grew until it contained 35 separate suspects. 35 names. 35 people pulled into the orbit of this case, questioned and investigated and evaluated, and in many cases never fully eliminated, simply set aside as the years accumulated and the technology of the time ran out of things to try. One name on that list carries a weight that still pulls at the imagination when you encounter it in the file. James Joseph Bulger, known to the world as Whitey Bulger, the future South Boston crime lord who would spend decades running an organized crime operation of staggering violence and corruption before dying in a federal prison cell in 2018. In the early 1950s, Bulger had lived in Great Falls. He had been arrested there for rape in 1951. He was violent. He was local. He fit the general outline of someone capable of what had been done on that gravel road and on that frozen embankment. Investigators kept him on the list for years. But Whitey Bulger did not fire the gun on the night of January 2, 1956. Neither did the airman from Malmstrom whom investigators questioned at length, nor any of the other 33 names that crowded the manila folders of a case that was slowly, year by year, becoming the heaviest file in the history of Cascade County law enforcement. The man who was responsible had been living less than 1 mile from Patricia Kalitzke's front door. He had been working with horses just blocks from where she slept every night. He had ridden the trails that crossed Vineyard Road, the very road where she was found. And in 65 years of investigative work spanning multiple generations of detectives, not one of them had ever knocked on his door. During the autopsy of Patricia Kalitzke in January of 1956, the pathologist performed a step that was, by the standards of that era, entirely routine. He swabbed her body. He transferred the collected biological material onto a glass microscopic slide and sealed it. In 1956, that glass slide was, from a forensic standpoint, almost entirely without value. The science that would one day be capable of reading what was preserved on it did not exist. The concepts that would eventually explain the information locked inside that biological material, deoxyribonucleic acid, genetic profiling, forensic genealogy, were decades away from the laboratory, let alone the courtroom. The slide went into a box. The box went onto a shelf in the Cascade County evidence room. And the years began to accumulate on top of it with the unhurried indifference of time that has no awareness of what it is burying. The Korean War ended. The Soviets launched Sputnik into orbit. Eisenhower gave way to Kennedy and Kennedy died in Dallas and Johnson sent young men to Vietnam. Men walked on the surface of the moon. Nixon resigned. The hostages came home from Iran. The Berlin Wall came down. The Soviet Union dissolved. The World Wide Web was born and grew until it connected nearly every human being on the planet to every other. And in a box in an evidence room in Great Falls, Montana, a glass slide sat in the dark, preserving its secret in biological material too small for the naked eye to read, waiting with a patience that had no choice but to be infinite. In 1988, a detective named Phil Madison opened that box. He pulled out the file and held the accumulated weight of 32 years of unanswered questions in his hands, and he felt the particular gravity of a case that has outlasted everyone who first worked it. Madison was not a man who put things down easily. He began chipping away at the cold case with the tools available to him, watching the science of forensic biology develop with the focused attention of someone who understood that the answer was not in the papers, it was in the biology, and the biology was waiting for the world to catch up to what it contained. In 2001, Madison made the decision that would prove, 2 decades later, to have been the most consequential single action in the 65-year history of the case. He packaged the 1956 glass slide and sent it to the Montana State Crime Lab for analysis. The results that came back carried the unmistakable texture of a future no one in 1956 could have imagined. The analysts had found a single sperm cell on the slide. It did not belong to Lloyd Duane Bogle. It belonged to an unknown male, a man with no name, no face, no address, and no record anywhere in any database that law enforcement could access. They uploaded the genetic profile extracted from that cell to CODIS, the National Combined DNA Index System, and they waited for the database to match it to something, to someone, to any record of any prior arrest that might have caught this man in its net. The database returned silence. The ghost had no criminal record. He had never been arrested. He had never been catalogued. He had lived his life entirely outside the reach of every system that might have named him. Phil Madison retired from law enforcement carrying the belief that the case might follow him into the grave before it ever delivered an answer. Sergeant John Cadner entered the story in 2012. He was 40 years old. He had grown up in small-town Iowa, transplanted to Montana and to law enforcement by the particular currents of a life that had brought him, eventually, to a desk with a cold case file sitting on it that was older than both of his parents. He was not handed the case with fanfare. There was no dramatic briefing, no wall covered in photographs, no team of analysts standing by. He was handed a box of aging paper and told that this was his. He began with a scanner. For months, he methodically converted mountains of yellowed, mold-scented documents into digital files, handwritten notes from detectives who had died before he ever moved to Montana, photographs that had been taken before color film was common, interview summaries from a world so different from his own that it might as well have been another planet. He read every word of every document. He built the geography of the case inside his mind until he could navigate its roads and timelines without a map. And he arrived, as Phil Madison had arrived before him, at the same immovable conclusion. The answer was not in the paper. The answer was in the biology. The answer was sitting on a glass slide in an evidence locker, and CODIS had already told them it would offer nothing more. The answer would have to be found by a different method, using a different science, applied by a different kind of investigator. In 2018, the world watched as a joint investigative team used a technique that had never before been deployed at scale in a criminal case to finally identify the man known as the Golden State Killer. His name was Joseph James DeAngelo, and investigators had found him not by searching for him directly, but by searching for his relatives. They had uploaded his DNA to the same commercial ancestry websites where millions of ordinary Americans go to look for their great-grandparents and their distant cousins and the branches of their family trees they never knew existed. They had built a family tree backward from his biology, branch by patient branch, until his name was the only name left standing at the end of the line. Sergeant John Cadner watched this unfold and understood immediately, with the clarity of someone who has been waiting years for exactly this kind of development, what it meant for the glass slide sitting in Great Falls. In 2019, he packaged the microscopic evidence and sent it to Bogle Technology, a forensic laboratory in Virginia that had developed some of the most advanced capabilities in the world for extracting genetic profiles from degraded biological samples. The scientists at Bogle Technology extracted a complete genetic profile from a sperm cell that had been sitting on a glass slide for 63 years. A ghost made entirely of data, assembled from biological material older than most of the people then living, complete and readable and ready to be introduced to the vast interconnected map of human genetic connection that the Ancestry database world had spent the previous decade constructing one voluntary submission at a time. If you are still watching at this point, drop a comment below right now with the words "I am still here," or tell us where in the world you are watching from. Let us see who is truly following this story all the way through. Because what comes next, what the DNA found, and who it led to, and what that person had been doing for 65 years while the families of Patricia Kalitzke and Lloyd Duane Bogle went without answers, is the part of this case that changes everything. The genetic profile extracted from that 63-year-old cell did not announce a name. It does not work that way. What it did was drop a pin on an enormous and intricate map of human biological connection, a map built from the voluntary DNA submissions of millions of people who had sent their saliva to ancestry companies looking for nothing more complicated than a sense of where they came from. The forensic genealogists working with Bogle technology began building a family tree backward from that single cell, following the invisible architecture of inherited biology through the recorded and catalogued histories of thousands of people who had no idea that their genetic information was about to become the instrument by which a 65-year-old murder would finally be solved. Branch by branch, the tree was constructed. Relatives were identified. Connections were traced. Lines were followed forward and backward through generations until the shape of the unknown man's biological family began to emerge from the data with increasing clarity and precision. The search narrowed until it pointed toward 3 primary genetic branches. 2 of those branches, when followed forward through geography and history and the documented movements of the people connected to them, led investigators nowhere near Great Falls, Montana, in January of 1956. The 3rd branch led directly to a man who had spent 65 years living in a silence so complete that his name had never appeared on a single page of the investigative file that had consumed the careers and the hearts of every law enforcement officer who had ever worked the case. His name was Kenneth Gould. Sergeant John Cadner pulled every thread that Kenneth Gould's name made available to him. City directories from the 1950s. Property records. Old aerial photographs of Great Falls neighborhoods that had changed so much in the intervening decades they were barely recognizable. Employment records. The portrait that assembled itself from those documents, piece by careful piece, was so geometrically precise in its implications, so perfectly aligned with the geography of the crime, that it must have produced in Cadner that particular combination of certainty and vertigo that investigators describe when a case finally, after years of pressure, gives way all at once. In January of 1956, Kenneth Gould had lived less than 1 mile from Patricia Kalitzke's home. He had worked training and corralling horses in the neighborhood, a profession that kept him outdoors, mobile, and intimately familiar with the roads and trails and open spaces that connected that part of Great Falls to the places where the victims had been found. He had ridden those trails regularly. He had ridden on and near Vineyard Road, the road where Patty's body had been found at the bottom of a 20-foot embankment, 5 miles north of the Sun River. He knew that road. He had been on it enough times that it would have felt ordinary to him. He knew the embankment. He had, in all probability, ridden past it on horseback in the ordinary course of his working life. And then, 38 days after the murders of Patricia Kalitzke and Lloyd Duane Bogle, Kenneth Gould had sold his family land. He had packed up and left Great Falls without looking back. He bounced across 3 Montana towns in the years that followed before leaving the state entirely in 1967. He settled in the Ozarks region of Missouri, far from the northern plains and the frozen rivers and the gravel roads where 2 young people had been left in the dark. He raised his children there. He grew old. He lived the remainder of his life in the ordinary rhythms of a man with nothing remarkable about him. He died of natural causes in 2007. He was cremated. His ashes were gone before the science that would identify him had even been sent to the laboratory. In January of 1956, Kenneth Gould had been 29 years old. He was married. He was the father of a baby who had been alive for only 2 months at the time of the murders. He trained horses. He kept to himself. He was a Great Falls native with no criminal record, no visible connection to either victim, and no reason to attract the attention of an investigation that was simultaneously examining 35 other people whose names had come up through tips and associations and the ordinary investigative logic of the era. He was invisible not because he was clever in any extraordinary way, but because there was nothing obvious about him that pointed toward what he had done. He was a man living a life that looked, from every external angle available to the investigators of 1956, entirely ordinary. There was one detail that Sergeant Cadner noted and could not set aside once he had seen it. When Kenneth Gould was 25 years old, he had married a girl who was 16 years old at the time. Patricia Kalitzke, on the night she was murdered, was 16 years old. Cadner did not overstate the significance of this parallel. He did not need to. The rest of the evidence was speaking with sufficient volume on its own. With Kenneth Gould's body cremated and his physical remains long since returned to the earth, there was no possibility of obtaining a direct DNA sample from the man himself and comparing it to the material on the 1956 glass slide. The bridge between the suspect and the evidence would have to run in a different direction, through the biology of the people he had left behind in Missouri. Cadner contacted Gould's children. He told them, with whatever combination of directness and care that a situation of that particular and terrible nature demands, what 65 years of science and investigation had uncovered. What their father's DNA, traced through their own genetic material, appeared to be connected to. He told them what the evidence was pointing toward. What the family tree had found at the end of its longest branch. 3 of Kenneth Gould's children agreed to provide DNA samples for comparison. They did not argue with the investigators. They did not hire lawyers and build walls and issue statements through intermediaries. They did not defend the man or demand that the conclusion be different from what the science was suggesting. They said yes, and they held still, and they waited alongside Sergeant John Cadner and the ghost of a 65-year-old case that had become, in some ways, older than all of them. The forensic laboratory compared the DNA profiles extracted from the children's samples to the single sperm cell that had been collected from Patricia Kalitzke's body in January of 1956, sealed onto a glass slide by a pathologist who could not have imagined what he was preserving or for how long it would need to remain preserved. The comparison was not ambiguous. The results left no mathematical room for doubt, not a fraction of a % of uncertainty, not the smallest opening through which any alternative interpretation could be introduced. The genetic material on that glass slide, the material collected from Patty Kalitzke's body on the morning of January 4, 1956, belonged to Kenneth Gould. The ghost that had been hiding inside that glass slide for 65 years finally had a name. And one of the children of the man whose name it was, hearing the confirmation spoken out loud for the first time, said something that carries the entire moral and emotional weight of the case in a single quiet sentence. Sometimes, the child said, you just don't know everybody's secrets. Cascade County Sheriff Jesse Slaughter stood at a podium in Great Falls on June 8, 2021, and said the words that the families of Patricia Kalitzke and Lloyd Duane Bogle had been waiting 65 years to hear. The words that every detective who had ever opened that file and felt the weight of it had hoped someone, someday, would be able to say. The case had a name. The case had an answer. There would be no trial. There would be no handcuffs. There would be no moment of accountability administered in a courtroom to the man who had driven out to that gravel road in January of 1956 with the specific and terrible intention of doing what he did. Kenneth Gould had died in 2007, 14 years before the answer came. The mechanism of justice that requires a living defendant had no one left to operate on. What remained was the truth, spoken clearly and publicly and on the record, into a room in Great Falls where the families of the victims should have been sitting. But the silence that met that press conference was nearly as deep as the 65-year silence that had preceded it. Duane Bogle's brother had died in 2013, carrying the unresolved weight of his brother's murder into his own grave without ever receiving the answer he had spent his entire adult life waiting for. His widow spoke to Sergeant Cadner about what the open wound of that case had done to her husband across the arc of his life. She told him that not knowing is a specific and particular kind of poison. That it does not kill quickly. That it works slowly, year by year, hollowing out the space where peace is supposed to live, until the absence of an answer becomes its own kind of presence, something you carry everywhere and can never set down. Patty's sister was still alive when the press conference happened in 2021. But dementia had arrived ahead of the answer, had moved into the rooms of her memory and rearranged them until the truth, when it finally came, arrived at a door that could no longer be opened from the inside. The answer had come. And it had come too late for her to understand what it meant or feel the particular, complicated relief that 65 years of waiting had earned. And so the resolution of the oldest open double homicide in the recorded history of the state of Montana does not rest in a verdict read to a packed courtroom. It does not rest in handcuffs or a sentencing hearing or any of the formal structures through which justice usually announces itself. It rests in a glass slide smaller than a human fingernail, sitting in an evidence locker in Great Falls, Montana, held at a consistent temperature by a storage system that does not know or care what it is preserving. It rests in the decision of a pathologist in 1956 to seal biological material onto a piece of laboratory glass as a matter of professional routine, with no awareness of what he was doing or how long it would need to endure. It rests in the decision of Detective Phil Madison in 2001 to send that slide to a laboratory rather than leave it in the box where it had been sitting for 45 years. It rests in the arrival of Sergeant John Cadner in 2012, a man from small-town Iowa who was handed the heaviest file in Cascade County history and decided, without drama or announcement, that he was going to carry it until it was finished. That slide had sat through the entirety of the Cold War. It had sat through the Cuban Missile Crisis and the assassinations of the 1960s and the moonwalk and the fall of Saigon and the bicentennial and the Reagan years and the first Gulf War and the rise of the Internet and September 11th and 2 decades of the 21st century. It had sat through the entire adult lives of Kenneth Gould's children, born to a man who carried his secret across state lines and into old age and all the way to the crematorium. It had outlasted the lies. It had outlasted the silence. It had outlasted the man who committed the crime by 14 years. And when a forensic laboratory in Virginia finally extracted its secret and a family tree built from the voluntary DNA of millions of ordinary people finally led a detective to the right door, that single cell, invisible to the naked eye of every investigator who had held the box, too small to be read by any instrument that existed when it was collected, spoke louder and more clearly and more finally than 65 years of silence had been able to suppress. Patricia and Kalitzke was 16 years old. She had a laugh that rearranged a room and a future spread out in front of her like the Montana horizon, flat and endless and full of light. Lloyd Duane Bogle was 18 years old. He had traveled far from home and found someone worth staying for, and he carried a camera because he understood, in the way that some people simply do, that the moments you are living through are worth the effort of remembering. They drove out together into the Montana dark on the night of January 2, 1956, full of everything that age is supposed to feel like. They deserved to drive back. They deserved the sunrise and the morning and every ordinary and extraordinary thing that was supposed to follow. The least that 65 years later and a glass slide and a forensic laboratory in Virginia and a detective from Iowa who refused to quit could deliver was the truth. And the truth, however late it arrived, however incomplete justice always is when the man responsible dies before the answer does, the truth is something. The truth is not nothing. The truth is Patty's name spoken clearly. The truth is Duane's name on the record. The truth is a file with a stamp on it that reads closed, and a case number that no longer belongs to the living list of Montana's unanswered questions. If this story stayed with you, if you carried Patty and Duane with you through every minute of this video the way this case carried itself through 65 years of silence demanding to be heard, then please do something right now. Subscribe to Cold Case, Solved Files if you have not already. Share this video with someone who needs to know that evidence does not expire, that a glass slide sealed in 1956 can speak clearly in 2021, that the passage of time is not the same thing as the end of the pursuit of truth. Leave a comment below and tell us what part of this case landed hardest for you. Tell us what you think about a world where a single microscopic cell outlasts the man who tried to take his secret to the grave. Tell us what Patricia Kalitzke and Lloyd Duane Bogle mean to you, two people who have been waiting 65 years for someone to say their names and mean it. This channel exists because victims deserve more than a dusty file and a door that no one bothers to knock on again. Cold case, solved files exists because Patty deserved the sunrise. Because Duane deserved to develop that film. Because justice, no matter how long it takes to arrive, no matter how incomplete it looks when it finally gets there, is always worth the pursuit. We will keep saying their names. We will keep opening the files. We will keep asking the questions that the silence has been trying to bury. And we will keep doing it for as long as there are cases left to tell and voices willing to tell them.